10. Boeing 707 in Belgium. There's an old Boeing 707 perched atop the Expo Gold Trade Hall and Transit Museum near the Belgian town of Veteran. Built in 1957, the aircraft once belonged to Sun Myung Moon, who started the highly controversial Unification Church religious movement. Under Moon's ownership, the plane had a mahogany bed, a private theater, and a bathtub with gold taps. In 1985, the president of Benin, a small French-speaking country in West Africa, acquired the aircraft. 5 years later, in 1990, it was grounded at Ostend Airport in Belgium due to safety concerns. The plane sat in place for the next 5 years while accruing a massive unpaid parking bill. A Belgian businessman relocated the plane to a parking lot near its current location. For a brief period, it functioned as a training facility for aircraft cleaners. But the local council disapproved of the 707 being parked at that location, and the owner was ordered to move it. After criticizing the decision as childish and petty, the owner had the plane placed on top of the Expo Center, where it remains to this day. 9. USS Sachem. Since the late 1980s, a rusting 186-foot boat has sat along a tributary of the Ohio River in Petersburg, Kentucky. Locals refer to her as the ghost ship, as she's in a clear state of disrepair. The USS Sachem was built in 1902 as a lavish yacht for a wealthy businessman. She was converted into a military vessel during World War I, when the US military started buying and leasing boats and ships from private owners to combat a shortage of seafaring vessels. Her main job was to patrol up and down the east coast of the US in search of German U-boats. After the war, the Sachem fell back into private ownership, only to be rented out again by the US Navy during World War II. Just like during the First World War, she patrolled the Atlantic for U-boats near the East Coast. Post-World War II, the boat was repurposed as a recreational vessel and eventually renamed the Circle Line 5. Her name is still visible today on her deteriorating hull. The boat was famously featured in Madonna's Papa Don't Preach music video. Shortly thereafter, she was anchored in her current location. It's unclear whether the owner plans to do anything with it or remove it from the river, or if the vessel will simply sit and rot indefinitely. 8. Elway Childress. If you drive through the small, sleepy city of Prairie du Chien in Crawford County, Wisconsin, you might pass by an old pushboat sitting in the field. Nobody seems to know how the 176-foot-long vessel known as the Elway Childress got to its current location more than 200 miles from where it sank. In fact, very little is known about the ship, period. The Elway Childress was built in 1948. It sank in the Mississippi River near Fort Madison, Iowa in December 1985. It happened after an early freeze caused large ice chunks to flow through the water, battering this and many other vessels. The boat was raised the following year before somehow ending up along Highway K in Prairie du Chien, where it's sat ever since. According to rumors, someone wanted to convert the derelict ship into a bed and breakfast at one point, but that never happened, and nobody seems to know who was behind these alleged plans or why nothing's been done with the Elway Childress. For the most part, the ship's interior is empty and falling apart. In other words, there's not much to see besides some old bathrooms, a fuse box, and a stove. But the boat remains a popular topic of discussion and curiosity, perhaps due to its visibility. After all, it's impossible to miss when driving by. 7. Harry Potter Locomotive. Deep in the forested countryside of Suffolk, England, there's a lone Harry Potter-style steam locomotive, almost completely hidden by overgrowth. In October 2022, an urban explorer and photographer named Steve Lydiard tracked the engine down. Describing the train as hidden in plain sight, he told the Shotley Peninsula Nub News that locals knew about the locomotive, but that they didn't know where it came from or why it was there. Lydiard said he put a lot of research into locating the engine, which sits on a real set of disused rail tracks. His findings revealed that the mysterious earliest locomotive was built in Scandinavia around 1950. During his visit, he noticed that it still smells like oil and smoke, despite sitting unused for over a half-century. The train was designed to withstand frigid Finnish winters. According to Redditors, it was purchased for use on an English train line, with plans to reconfigure the gauge to fit the country's railroad tracks. When doing so proved to be too expensive or impractical, the locomotive was simply left in place to rot. Little else is known about this historic relic, and those who know where it is have remained tight-lipped about its location in an effort to prevent it from being vandalized. Would you want to ride the Hogwarts Express? Let us know in the comments and hit subscribe while you're at it. 6. Okutama Ropeway. In western Tokyo, a cable car has sat abandoned for over a half-century, removed from the hustle and bustle of daily life in the center of the city. Dubbed the Okutama Ropeway, the 2,040-foot cable system was opened in 1962 in anticipation of the 1964 Olympics. It transported up to 36 passengers at a time over a lake between two stations called Kawano and Mito Sanguchi, with an elevation difference of just 2.1 feet between the stations. Passenger numbers weren't as high as predicted, and the cable car wasn't overly practical, especially compared to new bridges and other infrastructure that provided people with alternative routes across the lake. In other words, the ropeway was redundant and therefore wasn't very popular. In December 1966, just 4 years after it opened, operations were suspended until further notice. The system's been out of use ever since. Today, it's covered in graffiti and visibly aged, yet frozen in time, as if it's waiting to pick up its next group of passengers. Some people have described it as peaceful, while others said it feels eerie. There's a moss-covered stone staircase leading up to Mito Sanguchi Station, where shattered glass and debris lay on the floor of the crumbling station. The ropeway has become an off-the-beaten-path destination for travelers who are looking to divert from typical tourist attractions. 5. Ivory Coast airplanes. In 2010, a civil war broke out in the West African country of Côte d'Ivoire, or the Ivory Coast. Thousands of people died and the country's infrastructure was severely damaged and destroyed. Numerous planes were abandoned at Abidjan airport along the southern coast. In the aftermath of the crisis, a Tanzanian businessman named Aziz Alibai began buying the abandoned planes with plans to turn them into tourist attractions. His collection of 11 aircraft consists of a McDonnell Douglas DC-10, a Fokker 28, an Antonov AN-12, and at least 2 Boeing 737s. Alibai relocated the planes from the airport to his property in rural Songon, roughly 18.6 miles outside Abidjan. 8 of them are lined up along a 2,620-foot dirt airstrip that leads to a nearby lagoon. He doesn't like it when people refer to the planes as a graveyard, despite their visibly deteriorating condition. During an interview with the press in 2022, Alibai said that the defunct aircraft cost him an arm and a leg, and he preferred not to remember exactly how much he spent. The entrepreneur, who's in his 70s, said that some of the planes had to be cut into 2 or 3 pieces just to reach their current site without blocking the entire road. Alibai said that he plans to turn the disused aircraft into a restaurant, luxury lodging, and a conference room. It's unclear when he plans to do this, but he already welcomes curious visitors to the property. 4. The Bankhead train. In Banff National Park in Alberta, Canada, there's an abandoned mining town called Bankhead. Nicknamed the 20-year-old town, the settlement was established in 1903. At its peak, it was home to around 300 mine workers who harvested the coal that powered the trains along the Canadian Pacific Railway. The town consisted of homes, a school, and community buildings. Just as its nickname implies, Bankhead's existence was short-lived. The mine closed down in 1922 following a series of labor strikes, and because the coal that was being mined was of a poor quality. With no reason to stick around, residents left for opportunities elsewhere, and the town was soon abandoned. Today, much of Bankhead remains just as it was left, except much older. Visitors are free to explore the old buildings, coal trailers, and the small train that remains parked on some disused tracks, serving as a reminder of the bustling town that once existed in a place that's grown eerily silent. 3. Dictator's deserted plane and Goma Airport. From 1967 to 1997, the Democratic Republic of Congo was ruled by a dictator named Mobutu Sese Seko. During his 30-year rule, the country was called Zaire, and Mobutu's name became synonymous with the rampant human rights violations and corruption that he committed. The autocratic ruler accrued a massive amount of ill-gotten wealth, some of which he used to build a sprawling remote palace called Gabadolite. Nicknamed the Versailles of the jungle, the vast estate consisted of a mansion, swimming pools, a nightclub, a hotel, and an international airport. In 1997, Mobutu was forced into exile by rebel forces who overran the country. At the time, he was suffering from late-stage cancer and didn't have very long to live. He relocated to Togo, then to Morocco, where he passed away 3 months later. Today, the site is home to some of Mobutu's loyal supporters who once worked at the palace and younger generations of their families, but much of the property has sat abandoned since Mobutu was removed from power. The derelict complex is in an obvious state of disrepair, with entire structures missing their roofs and graffiti covering buildings and walls. There's also a dilapidated airplane missing its tail, which may have once functioned as one of Mobutu's personal jets. It's one of numerous abandoned aircraft found throughout the Congo's jungles, where overgrown airplanes have come to double as children's playgrounds. Some of the aircraft were abandoned in the violent wars that followed Mobutu's exile. Others crashed or were damaged in volcanic eruptions. In an unkept but heavily guarded section of Goma Airport, numerous deserted planes sit in limbo, deteriorating with an uncertain future as the country's leadership remains at the center of an ongoing power struggle. 2. Bangkok Aircraft Graveyard. The Ram Kang Hyang suburb outside of Bangkok, Thailand, is home to a collection of rusting planes, including a Boeing 747 and 2 McDonnell Douglas MD-82s. Since their arrival at the site in 2010, the aircraft have become a tourist attraction with a reputation as one of the world's most unusual abandoned places due to its proximity to people's homes. The property is owned by a Thai businessman who sells parts for scrap, and while visitors find it fascinating, it seems to be the source of some major ongoing problems. Over the years, the site has increasingly become an eyesore. It's littered with plane parts and partially dismantled aircrafts, which have been stripped of their seating, overhead compartments, and other fixtures. 3 homeless families were quick to set up headquarters on the airplane wasteland, which gave them the chance to make some cash by charging an entry fee of anywhere from 100 to 800 baht, $3 to $25. They made the interiors as cozy as possible and have told the press that it beats living on the street. While the families aren't particularly bothersome to the property owner or anyone else, living in a dilapidated old airplane raises some safety concerns. Last year, nearby residents noticed smoke spewing from one of the planes, along with a strong chemical odor. Thankfully, fire crews managed to get the blaze under control. They noticed that it appeared to have started in dry grass, but were unsure of the exact cause. 1. Abkhazian Railway. Located along the Black Sea coast at the intersection of Western Europe and Asia, Abkhazia is a partially recognized state that has sat at the center of power struggles for centuries. Most countries recognize Abkhazia as a part of the country of Georgia, while a handful recognize the territory as being under Russian military control. Only a few nations recognize Abkhazia as an independent state. During the collapse of the Soviet Union and a series of wars that followed, Abkhazia's railway fell into disrepair. Before then, it was part of the Russian-owned Trans-Caucasus Railway, which opened in 1871. During the early 90s, the part of the railway that connected Abkhazia to Georgia was destroyed. Parts of the route that connect Abkhazia to Russia are maintained and unkempt, but much of it remains in ruins. In some areas of this country that technically doesn't exist, old trains have been left to rust away with an uncertain future. As of 2023, 1963, the current Georgian Prime Minister, Irakli Garibashvili, said that the rail connection between Abkhazia and Georgia cannot reopen until the region fully rejoins the country. In recent years, there's been talk about secret negotiations to repair the network, but Garibashvili insists that these are just rumors and that there are no such hidden talks going on. He stressed the importance of focusing on the reunification of Abkhazia and Georgia before anything else. In the meantime, the railroad languishes as it falls further into neglect.
9. North Concord Air Force Base. Situated on a mountainside in one of Vermont's most remote regions, North Concord Air Force Base opened in 1956 as a radar base for monitoring early signs of a nuclear attack. Its isolated location on East Mountain was perfect for a military facility that wanted to keep its existence a secret from the public. The base was operated by 174 staff members, who lived lower on the mountain in a neighborhood of tin and steel huts called Quonset Village. They worked around the clock to protect the property from intruders while watching for potential signs of incoming missiles. The only way to reach the base was via a steep single-lane dirt road up the mountain. Life in the village was especially rough during the winter. Storms often made the road impassable, effectively cutting the base off from the rest of the world. In 1962, the base was renamed the Lyndonville Air Force Station. It was shut down just a year later due to overwhelming operating costs and because most of the equipment had become obsolete to newer technology. For decades, rumors of supernatural and extraterrestrial activity at the base have circulated. Much of the folklore stems from an alleged UFO sighting in 1961 by a couple named Betty and Barney Hill in nearby Lincoln, New Hampshire. The Hills claimed that they were abducted by aliens a few hours after seeing strange lights in the sky. While the story has never been proven, personnel at the base also witnessed bizarre lights in the sky that same night, and they were never able to come up with a logical explanation for what they saw. Since its closure, the base passed through the hands of several private owners. Today, it's in ruins and is extremely dangerous due to its deteriorating state. People have died exploring the site, but it hasn't stopped curious visitors from continuing to trespass onto the property. 8. Washington's abandoned missile silos. During the early 1960s, 18 underground missile silos were built throughout eastern and central Washington state. Each silo was built with 18,000 square feet of concrete, making the structures capable of withstanding a blast up to 50 times more powerful than the atomic explosion at Hiroshima during World War II. The silos were armed with intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs, that were capable of causing mass destruction on a previously unseen level. 5-member crews manned the silos around the clock and were capable of launching the deadly warheads within 15 minutes of receiving an order. Thankfully, that never happened. The closest the stations ever came to hitting the launch button was during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. As tensions between the US and the Soviet Union teetered on the brink of a nuclear war, the missiles at the silos in Washington were pointed at Cuba, where the USSR had installed its own missiles. Disaster was narrowly avoided, and the silo complexes continued to operate until the mid-1960s, when they were decommissioned and sold to private owners. Many people don't even realize that the bunkers exist, given their remote locations and discreet entrances. Most of the silos are in poor condition, and some are even flooded. Some of the structures have been repurposed for modern-day uses, like storing farm equipment, and at least one owner has converted their silo into a full-time residence. Despite going unnoticed by many, the sites unfortunately attract a lot of curious intruders who try to explore without the owner's permission. Mark Kramer, whose family has owned one of the silos since 1969, has repeatedly been the target of attempted break-ins. During an interview with the property owner in 2014, a spokesman review reporter observed bullet markings on the padlocks of the silo's doors as the result of people trying to shoot the locks off. Kramer said that he would gladly show the people the silo if they asked permission, which is what any explorer should do when they're interested in checking out a historic property. 7. Fort Pike. After the War of 1812, President James Monroe ordered the construction of a series of coastal defenses from Louisiana to the Florida Panhandle. One of the sites, known as Fort Pike, was built along the Rigolette's Pass, which connects Louisiana's Lake Pontchartrain to the Gulf of Mexico. Fort Pike functioned as a stopover point during the forced relocation of Native Americans in the 1830s, known as the Trail of Tears. It was also used as a holding facility for prisoners during the Seminole Wars in Florida. During the Civil War, the Union captured the base from the Confederacy and used it as a training facility. The site was abandoned in 1890 without a single cannon ever having been fired, and in 1972, it was added to the National Register of Historic Places. By the time Hurricane Katrina battered New Orleans in 2005, Fort Pike was already deteriorating. The storm surge completely submerged the fort, leaving it in even worse condition and destroying several nearby buildings. Subsequent hurricanes forced the park's closure again in 2008 and 2012. In 2015, the crumbling site was closed indefinitely due to state budget cuts. According to the official website, Fort Pike is currently closed to the public. 6. Fort Segarra. Located just 1,800 feet from the island of St. Thomas, Water Island is the smallest of the U.S. Virgin Islands. In 1944, the U.S. Army built barracks, gun emplacements, watchtowers, underground bunkers and tunnels, and other installations near the island's southern shore as part of a planned series of seacoast batteries, known as Fort Segarra. The fort's purpose was to protect a nearby submarine base on neighboring St. Thomas. In addition to the structures themselves, the military built roads, docks, and water, sewage, and power systems on the island. The war ended before the base was finished being built, and it was subsequently abandoned. From 1948 to 1950, the Army's Chemical Warfare Division used the fort as a site for testing poisonous gases and chemical agents on goats and pigeons. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has conducted several investigations to assess whether anything dangerous has been left behind from the military's past use of the site. All known munitions and debris have been removed from the property, and the underground complex is open to the public. Would you want to check out this underground complex? Let us know in the comments and hit subscribe while you're at it. 5. Mickelsen Safeguard Complex. In a remote corner of North Dakota near the small city of Nekoma, a reinforced concrete pyramid stands tall against the open sky. Surrounded by several smaller and equally mysterious buildings, the site is formally known as the Stanley R. Mickelsen Safeguard Complex. Nicknamed the Nekoma Pyramid, the complex was built at the height of the Cold War during the 1960s, with the purpose of being able to shoot down incoming Russian missiles should the need arise. The $6 billion project called for the construction of dozens of storage and launching silos, and the pyramid itself, which housed a radar system for detecting incoming nuclear missiles. It was the first operational anti-ballistic missile system in the United States, but the site was only operational for a short period before it was shut down due to the enormous costs of running it. Its location was also an issue, raising questions about the site's ability to deter a Soviet missile attack and the potential of firing missiles over friendly territory. The complex was decommissioned during the 1970s after operating at full capacity for just 6 months. Very few people have been allowed in ever since, with most visitors getting no closer to the fenced-off property than a nearby roadside where they can snap pictures. In 2020, a county job development agency bought part of the site, including the pyramid, with plans to restore it and turn it into a data processing and security center. The rest of the property is owned by a Hutterite community. 4. Adak Station. In 1942, the U.S. military established an airfield on Adak Island, a 275-square-mile landmass situated toward the western end of Alaska's Aleutian Island chain. The base was built in response to the Japanese capture of Kiska Island, which is located roughly 250 miles west of Adak, and Attu Island, which is another 200 miles to the west. During the war, the U.S. Army Air Forces used the site as a forward base for attacking Japanese forces at Kiska and Attu. The campaign to recapture the islands was successful, and Adak Station remained in service after the war ended. functioning as a key operations and supply facility for the American military. During the Cold War, the sprawling 76,000-acre site was home to a sonar-based submarine detection system called SOSUS, which was used for tracking Soviet submarines. A lot of the activities that went on at the base were kept secret from the public, including the submarine surveillance. Adak was decommissioned in 1992. It officially closed in 1997 as part of the post-Cold War base realignment and closure, or BRAC plan, which saw the closure of 350 military bases between 1988 and 2005. Over a 40-year period, large amounts of hazardous waste were disposed of at Adak, including unexploded ordnance, petroleum, pesticides, and highly carcinogenic industrial chemicals called PCBs. Cleanup efforts began during the 1990s, after the base became a designated Superfund priority site, and are ongoing. 3. Fort Carroll. Maryland's Patapsco River is home to a 3.5-acre man-made island and abandoned hexagonal military base called Fort Carroll. Located near the Francis Scott Key Bridge, the seafort was built in 1848 to protect Baltimore from naval attacks. It was commissioned by Robert E. Lee, who would go on to command the Confederate Army during the American Civil War 13 years later. Fort Carroll never saw combat, but it was considered a crucial fixture for defending Baltimore. By World War I, the structure and its weaponry were outdated, and the property was disarmed and abandoned in 1921. It's remained that way ever since, with the exception of being used as a firing range for a brief period during World War II. In 1958, a lawyer and a real estate investor named Benjamin Eisenberg bought the island with plans to build a casino, a hotel, and several restaurants. But a court ruled that the property is in a county where slot machines are illegal, and other business ventures failed to take off. Eisenberg ended up doing nothing with the fort, but as of 2019, the family still owned it. By then, the decaying structure had become a de facto sanctuary for hundreds of seagulls, herons, and other wild birds. Fort Carroll had been on the National Register of Historic Places since 2015 and is reportedly for sale under the requirement that the buyer agrees to restore the property. 2. Roosevelt Roads Naval Station. Located on the eastern coast of Puerto Rico in the town of Ceiba, Roosevelt Roads was commissioned as a U.S. naval operations base in 1943. Measuring nearly 5 by 4 miles, the 8,650-acre property consisted of a large airfield with an 11,000-foot runway, deep water port facilities, radar stations, and other military installations. It was home to hundreds of families at any given time, and was at the center of the local economy as a civilian employer. The base had a theater, barracks, houses, a golf course, stores, schools, and a hospital, and everything else you'd expect to see in a normal town. In 1999, locals began to protest the military activity in the area after a civilian employee was fatally struck by a stray bomb during a live fire exercise on nearby Viques Island. People were also concerned about the unexplained high cancer rate in the region. Roosevelt Roads closed down in 2004 and has been sitting abandoned ever since. Since then, most of the property has been handed back over to Puerto Rican government organizations for redevelopment. And while there are plans in the works for residential and commercial projects at the former base, much of Roosevelt Roads remains a ghost town. The U.S. Environment Protection Agency has identified dozens of areas of potential concern throughout the property, including landfills, hazardous waste burials, and a former power plant. Cleanup efforts are reportedly ongoing. 1. Chanute Air Force Base. The Chanute Air Force Base in Rantoul, Illinois, opened during World War I as a training center for military pilots. After the war ended, the base was expanded to accommodate housing and training for 15,000 military recruits. Chanute, nevertheless, experienced a housing shortage when the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941 triggered an influx of patriotic young enrollees who were eager to train and serve their country. At its peak, the base was home to 25,000 recruits, many of whom had to stay in tents. The facility was slated for closure when the U.S. began making plans to downsize its military bases toward the end of the Cold War. After operating for 75 years, Chanute was finally slated for closure. It was the country's third oldest active base when it finally shuttered its doors in 1993. Parts of the property have been redeveloped as motels, retirement communities, restaurants, a fitness center, a data center, and a few light manufacturing facilities. Much of the facility remains abandoned because it's contaminated. Cleanup efforts at the designated EPA Superfund site are ongoing, and some buildings have been demolished. After sneaking onto the base, photographer Walter Arnold told Atlas Obscura that he was shocked by how deteriorated it was. It looked like it had been abandoned for 50 years and was covered in graffiti, mold, asbestos, ceiling tiles, and other debris. Old curtains, furniture, telephones, a vintage arcade game, and other objects are scattered throughout the buildings. Sadly, the closure of Chanute has had a major negative impact on the local economy. Half of the population left, and home values plummeted, and the area is reportedly still recovering today. 9. River Country. Opening in 1976, River Country was Disney World's first water park. It was designed to look like a natural swimming hole with a sand-bottom lake, an inner tube river, and an artificial mountain featuring water slides. Its longest water slide measured 260 feet, 79 meters, and 160 feet, 49 meters long, and emptied into the lake. In 1980, a guest died from a brain-eating amoeba infection he caught from the lake water. Disney was cleared of any wrongdoing, since the amoeba's presence in Florida's freshwater lakes is beyond anyone's control. 2 years later, another guest drowned after coming off a water slide. His family accused the park of failing to warn visitors of how deep the water was, and lifeguards testified that they had rescued dozens of people in that part of the lake. But then, 7 years later in 1989, a similar drowning occurred. But it was the construction of the Typhoon Lagoon water park that caused River Country to become less popular. It nevertheless continued to operate until 2001, when it shuttered its doors after being in business for 25 years. River Country's slides, bridges, and other fixtures were abandoned, and nature quickly began to reclaim the disused park. Vines wrapped themselves around signs, dead trees fell onto water slides, and vegetation grew on walkways and staircases. Trespassing onto the site came with major risks, including a lifetime ban from Disney theme parks. So most people opted to play it safe and respected the park's orders to stay off the property. Those who paid close attention sometimes managed to catch a glimpse of River Country from afar before it was demolished in recent years. 8. Monorail in the desert. Disney World's Monorail is a legendary staple of the theme park in Orlando, enabling guests to quickly and easily travel between destinations within the sprawling 43 square mile, 111.4 squared kilometers resort complex. But one of these famed trains was found strangely out of place in 2021, when Twitter user Theme Park Shark spotted an abandoned Disney monorail in the Nevada desert. Considering Nevada's proximity to California, it would have been easy to assume that the train came from the Disneyland park in Anaheim. But the manufacturing details clearly state that the Mark IV monorail was built at Disney World in Florida. It's possible that the train was shipped to Disneyland and used there, but unfortunately, the details of its history are unclear. According to the Disney-dedicated Inside the Magic blog, Las Vegas has used monorails built by Disney in the past, suggesting that the train in the desert once operated throughout the city. In addition to lacking any details about the train's service life, nobody seems to know how, when, or why it ended up in the desert. How do you think this Disney monorail ended up in the desert? Let us know in the comments and hit subscribe while you're at it. 7. Nara Dreamland. In 1961, a Disney-inspired theme park called Dreamland opened in Nara, Japan. It contained many recognizable features that resembled well-known Disneyland fixtures, including a Main Street USA, a bobsled ride similar to the Matterhorn bobsleds, a monorail, and a Sleeping Beauty-like castle. Dreamland wasn't an official Disney park, but at the time, it was the closest thing to a Disneyland experience that was offered in Japan. The park was initially very popular, but visitor numbers began to decrease noticeably after the opening of Tokyo Disneyland in 1983. Dreamland's popularity dwindled even more after Tokyo Disney Sea and Universal Studios Japan opened in 2001. Stores and attractions within the park began closing down in 2004. Around the same time, rides and other structures began rusting and showing other signs of age. Dreamland permanently shuttered its doors in 2006. The deserted property became overgrown, silent, and covered in graffiti. Disused roller coasters loomed silently and ominously over the surrounding area, while falling further into disrepair. The property was a popular attraction among urban explorers until it was demolished in 2016. 6. Splash Mountain. When the first Splash Mountain log flume ride opened at Disneyland in California in 1989, it was one of the most expensive projects in Disney history. 4 years later, in 1992, a second Splash Mountain ride was opened in the Magic Kingdom Park at Disney World in Florida. A third version opened the very next day at Tokyo Disneyland in Japan. For decades, Splash Mountain was one of Disney's most iconic rides. Inspired by the cartoon characters from the 1946 movie Song of the South, the ride began peacefully as the passenger-filled log slowly climbed a steep hill. The vehicle then traveled through a dark, anxiety-inducing indoor area, and then ended with a 52-foot, 15.8 meters drop. In 2020, Disney announced its plans to revamp the Splash Mountain rides at Disneyland in Anaheim and Disney World, based on the 2009 movie The Princess and the Frog. The decision came amid years of criticism against the outdated and arguably racist Song of the South movie, which was described in the Disney Dose blog as a problematic portrayal of plantation life. In addition to the new theme, inspired by Disney's first Black Princess, the ride will also go by a new name, Tiana's Bayou Adventure. Splash Mountain took its final run at the Magic Kingdom in January 2023 and has since been closed for remodeling. The Splash Mountain ride in Anaheim followed 4 months later. And while neither of the rides are technically abandoned, they sure seem that way now that they're not running. But this won't be the case for long. Assuming the project stays on schedule, Tiana's Bayou Adventure is scheduled to open at both Disney World and Disneyland in late 2024. 5. Mark Twain Riverboat. Disney's parks are home to several paddle wheel steamers known as the Disney Riverboats. Disneyland Park in Paris is home to 2 riverboats, the Mark Twain, a nod to the renowned 19th century American writer, and the Molly Brown, which was named after the famously outspoken Titanic survivor Margaret Molly Brown. Located in the park's Frontierland section, each boat took riders on a short ride through a fictional town called Thunder Mesa, while playing an audio recording of an imagined conversation between the boat's captain and the person the boat was named after. Twain Riverboat stopped operating in 2011 and hasn't been used since. In 2014, Disney bloggers revealed that the vessel was falling into a sad state of disrepair, as it sat abandoned in full view. After visiting the park and seeing the derelict eyesore firsthand, a writer for the amusement park blog Theme Park Tourist wrote that parts of the boat's wooden structure looked as though they had detached altogether and fallen into the water. According to the blogger, the Mark Twain had spent much of the previous 3 years in dry dock, but it had recently been moved into the water so the Molly Brown could undergo a much-needed refurbishment. Being in the water seemed to be accelerating the Mark Twain's deteriorating state. In 2019, a Disneyland Paris spokesperson announced that the decaying riverboat would undergo a major restoration. He predicted that it would return to service in 2021, but that never happened. In 2022, the Disney-dedicated blog ED92 reported that the Mark Twain had disappeared from view. According to the article, funding that had been set aside for the boat's repairs had been redirected toward another project. It's probably safe to assume that the Mark Twain's glory days are over for good. But the park has not made any official disclosures about its fate. 4. PeopleMover. Located in the Tomorrowland section of Disneyland in Anaheim, California, the PeopleMover transport attraction opened in July 1967. It featured 4-car trains that ran along an elevated monorail track, providing visitors with a calm, leisurely tour through Tomorrowland. Commentary played through speakers on each train, pointing out various attractions as the ride passed by. The cars themselves were not propelled by engines, but by rotating tires that were placed every 9 feet, 2.7 meters along the track. Each tire had its own electric motor. 2 guests were crushed to death by the PeopleMover in separate accidents that occurred in 1967 and 1980. Cases involved young men who got caught on the track while jumping between cars. In the first incident, which happened just a month after the PeopleMover opened, a guest was run over in a tunnel and dragged several hundred feet before the operator managed to stop the ride. When the PeopleMover first opened, its design was considered futuristic. But as the decades passed, it became one of the park's classic rides. It closed in 1995 as part of a cost-saving effort to shut down outdated and expensive attractions. The ride's track remains unused, but is still maintained by park staff. Over the years, there have been rumors and discussions about the possibility of reopening the PeopleMover, and in 2022, park employees were seen clearing overgrowth near the ride. But there have been no official announcements regarding the PeopleMover's return. And while many would love to see it come back to life, others have complained that the defunct track has become an eyesore. 3. Wonders of Life Pavilion. Located in Epcot's former Future World area in 1989, the now-defunct Wonders of Life Pavilion was dedicated to human health, medicine, nutrition, and fitness. The idea of dedicating a section of the park to wellness dates as far back as Epcot's planning stages. But the park's planners struggled to find a sponsor to finance the endeavor. It wasn't until 7 years after Epcot opened its doors that the MetLife insurance company got on board with the idea and provided the funding necessary to turn the wellness exhibition vision into a reality. The Wonders of Life Pavilion featured 2 main attractions, including a thrill ride called Body Wars and a comedy show about the brain called Cranium Command. MetLife ended its sponsorship in 2001, and the pavilion began to slowly decline. 3 years later, in 2004, park officials decided to only open it on a seasonal basis. The pavilion continued to operate during peak visiting times during the spring and holiday seasons. In 2007, it shuttered its doors permanently. Over the next few years, signs and other features were removed from the building, making it clear that the attraction's days were over for good. Disney never gave an official reason for closing the pavilion, and the building has sat largely abandoned ever since. It's still used by staff, but has been closed to the public for more than 15 years. In 2019, Disney announced plans to use the building for a new play pavilion for children, with plans to open it by Father's Day 2021. The new attraction missed its projected opening date, and in early 2023, the new attraction was quietly removed from Epcot's maps. It's unclear whether Disney still has any upcoming plans for the disused pavilion. 2. The legendary Years Hotel. Disney World's neighboring Art of Animation and Pop Century resorts are 2 of its most popular properties among families traveling on a budget. The resorts are located right next door to one another and share a station along Disney's Skyliner gondola system, despite their themes having almost nothing in common. This is because most of the Art of Animation's resorts buildings were originally supposed to be part of the Pop Century Resort, which was designed to be twice its current size. According to the initial plans, half of the Pop Century Resort would feature a classic years theme based on music from each decade between the 1950s and the 90s. The other half would feature a legendary years layout based on music from each decade between 1900 and 1940. These plans were hampered by the 9/11 attacks on the World Trade Center towers in New York City, which heavily impacted America's tourism industry. As a result, construction on the Pop Century Resort was put on hold indefinitely. Finally, in late 2003, the Classic Years section of the resort opened its doors. The Legendary Years section of the resort remained undeveloped, unused, and fenced off for several years, and it was an eyesore to guests. Finally, in 2010, 7 years after Pop Century opened its doors, Disney announced plans to finally complete the unfinished property. But instead of going with the Legendary Years theme, the company decided to create a separate resort, the Art of Animation, which is themed after its animated films. It opened its doors in 2012 and has remained a favorite among guests ever since. 1. Discovery Island. Located in Bay Lake, Discovery Island is a small 11.5-acre, 4.7 hectares landmass that was once home to an exotic animal and bird park. It operated for 25 years, from 1974 and 1999, before shuttering its doors for good. While Disney's reasons for closing Discovery Island are unclear, it's believed that poor attendance and high maintenance costs were factors in the decision. The former park has sat abandoned ever since, as it falls into an increasingly derelict state. Trespassing is strictly forbidden, but the property nevertheless attracts curious urban explorers like Shane Perez, a blogger who swam through alligator-infested waters in the middle of the night with his friends to reach Discovery Island. The group visited in 2009, roughly a decade after the park closed. One of the first things Perez noticed was the thousands of birds that he and his fellow explorers were surrounded by, including several angry vultures that they encountered. During their time on Discovery Island, they discovered that the electricity still worked, even though the property had not been in use for 10 years. Perez and his pals captured photos of some of the haunting remnants of the overgrown property, including Polaroid photos of employees scattered inside deserted buildings, preserved snakes inside jars, garbage, and an empty Coca-Cola bottle. In April 2020, another unwelcome visitor somehow found his way to Discovery Island. Authorities found the homeless man, named Richard McGuire, camping in the defunct park. When they ordered him to leave, he described the island as a tropical paradise and said that he didn't know he wasn't allowed to be there. Like almost everyone who gets caught trespassing on Disney property, McGuire was banned from all Disney parks for life. Thanks for watching. Would you want to explore any of these abandoned Disney places? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. See you soon. Bye.